Welcome to another edition of After Hours. Today I wanted to take a chance to talk about what I would, for lack of a better term, would call the positive nature of love. On Sunday we looked at the two greatest commandments. Remember, Jesus was queried by the lawyer and said, what's the greatest commandment in the law? And Jesus said, I'll tell you two of them. Love God with all your heart, soul, and mind. Love your neighbor as yourself. And he said, and all the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. So we were looking a little bit at love, and I want to talk a little bit more about the nature of love itself, and in particular how love is positive. It's not just an emotion, it's something that actually leads to actions. It positively reaches out. It's not static, it's dynamic, it's moving. It reaches out to actually connect with and serve someone else. That's the very nature of love. Now, why do I say this? This is because love, as I said, is a summary of the entire Old Testament and particularly the moral law, and specifically the Ten Commandments. We noted how the Ten Commandments are actually split in half. The first four commands deal with loving God with all your heart, soul, and mind. You don't have other gods, you don't make idols, you don't misuse God's name, and you remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. And then loving our neighbor, loving other humans, is broken down in the other six commands. We honor our parents. We do not murder. We do not commit adultery. We do not steal. We don't give false testimony or lie regarding our neighbor, and we don't covet. These are the two halves of the Ten Commandments, and they are dealing with the nature of love. But the Ten Commandments, even though they give negative commands, in other words, it says things like don't worship other gods, but that includes the command by implication that you must worship the one true God. And when they are expanded out, it's not enough to just not worship other gods. You must actually worship the one true God. When you move to the second half in loving our neighbor, we see the exact same thing. For example, when Paul kind of lays out the implications of the eighth commandment about not stealing. In the book of Ephesians, he tells us that you don't steal, you work hard with your hands, and you share material possessions with those in need. It's not enough to not only not steal, we must be generous and actually sharing with others, or else we're not keeping that command. So we have to work with doing all of this. And so, for example, also you could take the command to murder. It requires us to actually not only not harm the other person, but to positively work for their good. So all of this is seen in the Ten Commandments. And furthermore, this is worked throughout the entire Old Testament, especially in the prophets and in the New Testament. As I mentioned just a moment ago, when you go to the New Testament, you always see that these commands in the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments, are always expanded to have the positive implication as well. So if you look at Ephesians 4:28, you see where Paul talks about stealing, and it becomes being generous. In every case, the positive implication is brought out. So in other words, it's not enough to say, well, I'm not harming someone, so that's good enough. No, we are called to positively love them. The summary of the law is not just avoiding the negative, it's actually doing the positive. And thirdly, if you think about this, it's not only that was the Decalogue, and that's how it is worked out in the remainder of the Old Testament and New Testament. But thirdly, in one of the times where Jesus had a discussion with someone and they summarized the law this way, he asked them, how do you read the law? And they gave the exact same summary, the exact same two commands. But then the person said, well, who's my neighbor? And Jesus told the parable of the Good Samaritan. And think about the parable of the Good Samaritan. The lawyer is wanting to justify himself, we're told in Luke chapter 10. And he's wanting to do this by narrowing down this command to love your neighbor as yourself. And he wants to do it one of two ways, either by narrowing down who is my neighbor, which Jesus answers by saying, well, the neighbor in that parable is people who have needs. When you come across a person who has a need, that person is now your neighbor. But secondly, by implication of the way Jesus tells the parable of the Good Samaritan, we can also narrow down what it means to love my neighbor as myself by what is required by love. So we not only can restrict neighbor, we can do it by saying we love as long as we're not actively harming the other person. But of course, in the parable we see the priest and the Levite who went by the man who had been injured, they didn't actually do anything to him. They didn't harm him. They didn't, steal from him. They didn't throw him in the ditch. But the implication of the parable is they had failed to fulfill this command. They did it by simply doing nothing, because love is not a requirement just to abstain from the evil, but we are commanded to actually be doing the good. And this leads to the final reason. Love is rooted in the very nature of the Trinity. And the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, their love has been an active, outreaching love from all of eternity. They aren't just existing around one another and managing to not sin towards one another. They are positively seeking one another. That's the nature of their love. It is an overflowing, expressive love. And therefore, we who are made in the image of the Trinity are also called to walk in love in the same way. So when we talk about loving others, loving our neighbor as we love ourselves, and also loving God, it's not enough to say, well, I'm not doing the negative. I'm not worshiping other gods. I don't have any idols in my house. Nor is it enough to avoid the negative with other human beings. Well, I'm not actively harming somebody. The call is that we actually do the positive, that I positively love God with heart, soul, mind, and strength, and that I positively am loving my neighbor as myself, acting like the Good Samaritan in the parable. Of course, as we saw on Sunday, all of us fall short in this. Thanks be to God, Jesus has kept the law for us. But now as Christians, the Holy Spirit is working to help us live in this way. Paul tells us in Galatians 5 that faith expresses itself by love. So faith we have in Jesus Christ is now working to express itself in love for God and love for neighbor, a positive love that actually reaches out to know and serve others. I hope this is helpful to you. I hope you have a great week, and I look forward to gathering for worship again this Sunday. God bless.